Greetings from our channel again. Johnny Carson rose to prominence as one of the most well-known presenters and entertainers over his 4-decade career. He was the dominant force in late-night television from the 1960s until the early 1990s. The well-known talk show host is infamously unhappy with one legend in particular, despite having a lengthy interview and conversation history with many notable people. Along with his alleged favorites, Johnny Carson's intolerant guests will be the do not let this opportunity pass you by. Keep watching. Before we get to the big topic, let's talk about who Johnny Carson is. John William Carson was born on October 23, 1925, and was originally from Corning, Iowa. In the midst of their family, he was born to Ruth Elizabeth and Homer Lloyd Kit Carson. He was raised in Norfolk, Nebraska, after his family relocated there when he was 8 years old. Since he was a little boy, Carson has fostered an interest in and aptitude for the performing arts. And isn't practicing magic the ideal activity for kids? When 12-year-old Carson discovered a magic book, he did exactly that. His next purchase was a magician's kit, which he immediately tested out in front of his loved ones. A game of chance to start. His parents, especially his mother, were always there for him. They even knitted him a cloak to wear to the local Kiwanis Club performances. At the age of 14, he performed for the first time, charging $3. He swiftly had a lot more gigs after that. It appeared as though fate had already chosen Carson because he was already succeeding in Hollywood. He tried to hitchhike while posing as a midshipman and was fined $1.50. Carson's ascent to popularity ended when he enlisted in the U.S. Navy on June 8, 1943, and was deployed to the Pacific with the USS Pennsylvania. During the war, he was a communications officer who had to decode encrypted messages. He also had an impressive amateur boxing record of 15-01. Maybe he's working for someone. Carson continued to amuse, nevertheless, and even went so far as to claim that doing a magic show for the U.S. Forestal was the apex of James V's career as Secretary of the Navy. The future talk show host was impressed by the fact that even he could make the sour and endearing Forestal chuckle. Carson made the decision to enroll in an ELL and join the Phi Gamma once the war was over. He later received $1.25 for each presentation. A few months in, he decided he wanted to be a radio performer and switched his major from journalism to speech and drama. After receiving his degree, Carson started working as a broadcaster at WOW Radio in 1950. Despite his lack of expertise on the field, Carson's promise was evident shortly after he aired a morning TV show called The Squirrel's Nest. His career consequently took off rapidly. He then presented Who Do You Trust? And Johnny Carson's show, two well-liked but low-budget Carson shows. After his success on Who Do You Trust, NBC invited him to take over as host of The Tonight Show until Jack Paar left. Like many others, Parsons declined the opportunity because of the intense pressure to perform 105-minute interviews. Ultimately, NBC was able to sign him in February 1962. An account of what happened came next. The Tonight Show, featuring Johnny Carson, was the name of the program that Johnny Carson hosted until May 1992. Among the contemporary celebrities whose careers Carson helped launch while he was on the show are Jim Carrey, Ellen DeGeneres, Eddie Murphy, and Andy Kaufman. Carson has conducted interviews with many celebrities while hosting the late-night show. Even yet, the host hated one guy in particular. Bob Hope is a British comic book character. Bob Hope, a multi-talented actor who was a centenarian with a career spanning almost 8 decades, is well known for his comedy abilities, acting skills, and production abilities. Did you know? Throughout his life, Hope hosted the Academy Awards 19 times, more than any other actor. This British-American entertainer achieved it all and lived to reach 100 years old. He was as well known as everyone remembered, even though his real name was Leslie Towns Hope. Bob Hope was born on May 29, 1903, from humble beginnings. To earn money, he started doing stand-up comedy, singing, and dancing on the streets. Out of 7 children, he was the 6th. He was very adaptable, and like Carson, he briefly tried boxing in Impaki East while wearing a suit. In 1921, Hope was working as a lineman when a tree crushed his face, necessitating reconstructive surgery. Later in life, this gave him his unique appearance. His early career was filled with appearances on Broadway musicals and vaudeville events before he switched to radio appearances, primarily with NBC in 1934. His career truly took off in the 1950s when he started hosting regular TV shows, even though he was in movies from 1934 until 1972. He was praised as a pioneer in American stand-up comedy by critics, audiences, and fans for his one-liners and comedic timing. Hope's famous self-deprecating comments, in which he would usually start by complimenting himself before pulling himself down, will likewise endure in memory. Despite everything he has done and achieved, Carson never warmed up to him, especially in his later years. At his core, he is a humorous man. Johnny Carson never publicly expressed his distaste for Bob Hope. However, there is ample evidence that the popular talk show host didn't like the second choice. It wasn't until a certain book was out that the elephant in the room was proven. Richard Zoglin wrote the biography of Bob Hope, the entertainer of the century, and Simon Schuster published it. Due to his frequent appearances on The Tonight Show in the 1970s and 1980s, many people believed that Bob Hope was one of Carson's favorite guests. But the truth is a little different. Carson did not like him at all. The talk show presenter did respect Hope, but there was a good reason why he didn't like him. First of all, Hope always presents herself in the same way. He seems to be undergoing a spiritual initiation. Occasionally, as a surprise guest on the show, the comic would unexpectedly leave the stage as the credits rolled. He would then use his prepared jokes to engage Carson in a quick conversation before showing a video montage of his next performance to build anticipation. Hope would also depart as fast as he was on the show, as though he were always traveling. Since this act persisted during all of his appearances, you can only imagine how worn out everyone is, especially the host. Carson and Hope shared a lot in common, but they were never truly friends or co-workers. The Tonight Show producer Peter LaSalle continued by saying that Carson was not a big fan of Hope's work, despite the fact that he respected Hope's standing in the entertainment industry. These two men were NBC's top performers at the time, and their humorous approaches were exact replicas of each other. Hope's comedy was more current events oriented, with gags about the news that steered clear of political opinions, in contrast to Carson's more sophisticated comedy. Additionally, the latter possessed an improv talent that he did not, especially when Hope is hosting. His staff of writers wrote the latter's routines, and Hope's obvious lack of improv skills made it much more difficult for him to come up with impromptu humor. Since Carson knew that Hope was the only other NBC star who could challenge Carson's authority, the two men were in a sense rivals. NBC's primetime sensation since 1950, Hope, on the other hand, was riding high. Carson could not, therefore, refute that. According to pop cultural references, Hope was also the most well-liked radio personality on NBC during the 1930s and 1940s. The other man's ability to virtually guarantee an appearance on The Tonight Show without even a prelude, something Hope could do with relative ease, was one of the many reasons Carson hated him. Let me tell you, he had something to push almost constantly, and he would do so often if he wanted to market something. LaSalle remembered Carson's annoyed tone every time Hope booked himself on the show. However, whenever the producer asked whether the talk show host wanted to decline, Carson would invariably reply, "No, you can't turn down Bob Hope." The comic understood that Bob Hope was highly respected by NBC officials since he had helped bring the network to prominence. However, NBC gave him the freedom to appear on the show anytime he wanted to in an attempt to maintain a cordial relationship. When Bob Hope arrived at the last minute, Carson found it annoying. Furthermore, the act went on unabatedly even when the comedian's memory started to fail in his latter years. In order to maintain his charade, Hope gave Carson a list of questions he wanted answered, with the specific need that they be asked in the exact order they were listed, preventing any room for creativity. In the comedian's book, Hope's biographer Richard Zoglin wrote that Hope's declining hearing and vision made it more and more difficult for him to make cameos in his latter years, because he often found it difficult to comprehend Carson's questions. If he asked it out of order, Hope might answer with a different question. Since one of Carson's numerous talents was coming up with jokes on the spot and involving his guests in genuine conversation, he was understandably annoyed by this development. In his memoir, Carson would describe his time with Bob Hope and how he detested the interview because it was so rehearsed and thorough, including a lengthy list of the comedian's routines and Don Tyson, and because Hope's appearances caused the show's ratings to drop. Additionally, despite Jeff Sulzing's advice to limit highlight clips to 2 minutes, Carson's nephew, the show's producer, insists on utilizing 5-minute clips and won't listen to him. To be honest, Johnny Carson has been embroiled in a number of well-known conflicts, such as those with Wayne Newton and wealthy but unreliable Joan Rivers. Nevertheless, Bob Hope would have to be his least favorite visitor. Given that Bob Hope was the talk show host's least favorite guest, it stands to reason that Johnny Carson had other memorable guests that had an impact on both him and his audience. Another performer and singer, Frank Sinatra, was one of the prominent visitors on The Tonight Show. It's important to remember that Sinatra rarely granted interviews and that, when he did, very few people ventured to ask him questions. If you ever get to see Sinatra mocking someone, it's usually on the sofa of The Tonight Show with Don Rickles by his side. It was all good and there was no harm, if anything, because it made Sinatra feel at ease enough to show off his individuality. When Drew Barrymore was 7 years old, she was ecstatic to be sitting on the Tonight Show couch. She said to the talk show host that meeting the well-known Carson, who starred in Steven Spielberg's film, had been her longtime desire. The well-known radio presenter and filmmaker also had an insightful appearance on The Tonight Show in 1976. Wells brazenly declared during his guest appearance that he thought radio was the best kind of entertainment media because it required listening to the speaker. He used this as an example for people who watch too much TV and don't pay attention. Wells' assertions are accurate, and there is evidence of this even today. One of his most notable TV performances was on The Tonight Show, where he was able to laugh and joke about Carson. American comedian and actor Robin Williams was also a welcome addition to The Tonight Show. His obvious abilities were evident, and his unbounded energy only served to highlight the fact that he was still a young, budding genius. Even though he made appearances on other variety shows, many people will never forget his debut on Carson. Walter Cronkite, one of the most well-known American newscasters ever, interviewed Johnny Carson in 1982 to update Carson on his life since his final program. Cronkite's visit was instructive, much like Wells' interview, because he and Carson talked about the problems with TV news at the time and the impartiality of TV journalists. Cronkite was thrilled to be on the show, and he and Carson both laughed at the agony of a rookie reporter's last day on the job. American comedian Joan Rivers appeared on The Tonight Show as a guest more than 90 times, in addition to Bob Hope. According to MIX.net, Rivers swiftly rose to prominence as one of the most well-liked guest hosts due to the audience's warm reception of her. She stopped making appearances on The Tonight Show and eventually expanded her own television network. She reportedly told Carson that she was going to start her own program right before hers debuted. The latter then determined that she was not allowed to return to his show. Due to his consistent outstanding performances on The Tonight Show, Burt Reynolds was a significant figure in the 1970s. Given how well-liked he was whenever invited over, it was anticipated that the actor would be a regular guest on the show. It was even said that during Carson's tenure as host, Burt Reynolds appeared 61 times. Charlie's Angels star Farrah Fawcett made an appearance on The Tonight Show in 1984 to promote her upcoming movie, The Burning Bed. It's no surprise that many people tuned in, given how very different her job was from her usual fan and viewer material. This time around, she plays a burned-out woman who decides to burn her house down to defend herself and her kids. The actress and Carson had a great conversation about the play's meaning for her and how she prepared for her role. Now, it's all the more remarkable because Jack Gleason was a guest on The Tonight Show for the first time in 1985. Seeing Gleason's brilliant guest performance on The Tonight Show was more than enough. Jim Henson, who is considered by many to be the most famous puppeteer of all time, appeared on The Tonight Show with Kermit the Frog. Throughout the show, the audience and onlookers were in fits of laughter due to Kermit and Carson's humorous and engaging exchange. Naturally, it would be negligent to include Don Rickles' name here. Having made an astounding 100 appearances, he is probably the most well-liked guest on Johnny Carson's Tonight Show. It's safe to say that the comedian truly shined on The Tonight Show, and everyone loved this insult comic. Of course, among Carson's famous visitors in 1989 was Jay Leno, who would go on to host the show. Despite the fact that Fred Savage was the episode's featured guest, Jay Leno's amazing remarks, which resulted in a comical back and forth with Carson, stole the show. Even though Leno wouldn't take over as host for another 3 years, it was entertaining to watch Carson, the current host, interact with Leno, the show's future presenter. It was also a nice reminder that Jay Leno had the comic ability to be great and should be given the chance to follow Carson. If you liked the video, please subscribe and use the like button. Then, to ensure you don't miss any updates, make sure you hit the like and subscribe buttons while the notification bell is still on. Until then, keep shining.